our Sociology Tuesdays research seminar. So today we are quite privileged to have Dr. Khalade, who is going to be presenting to us today on a very interesting topic on maneuvering the closet and recloseting, negotiating freedom, agency, and safety amongst Black African queer women in post-apartheid South Africa. So Dr. Khalade Makafola holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Johannesburg. Her primary research interests are in gender, queer, and women's studies, as well as higher education studies and issues of marginality, and questions of difference in society rooted in decolonial Afrocentric feminist ideologies. Her research goals are directed at problematizing societies and creating pockets of inclusivity through the African cultural conceptions of Ubuntu and human rights frameworks. So it's quite an honor to have Doc to be presenting your work with us today. We really appreciate. So let me allow Doc to get us started.
Thanks, Doc. Thanks so much for that introduction. I'm just gonna turn on the camera for a bit to greet everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining, everybody, and thank you, Dr. Simba, for having me today. I'm very excited to talk about this important element in my work that I developed in my PhD thesis around the maneuvers of the closet amongst Black queer women in South Africa. So the ideas that I will share today are derived or come from the 30 Black queer women that I interviewed across the country and also across subjectivity. So this was including different ages, ethnic and cultural backgrounds, and also citizenship status and sexual orientations. So categorically, queer for my study meant women that identify within the umbrella of the LGBTQ. So I'm just gonna share my slides now and then get to the presentation. Can anyone please indicate if they can see my screen? Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so to give a bit of background, as most of us know, issues of being queer and queerness continue to be contentious in society, particularly in African societies, and they're perpetuated by our history of colonialism and apartheid, patriarchy, misogyny, and cultural erasure, and also the sexual violence that marginalized bodies are subjected to, which dates back or can be traced back in history in the colonial period where sexual violence was used as a weapon and a tool to exert power against Black people through their women. So these factors and dynamics, particularly, the sexual violence against Black women, further marginalize queer Black women bodies as the official sexual underclass. And that too is another, or I recognized it as another carefully orchestrated and engineered violation against non-conforming female bodies. And this is influenced by different issues around religious and cultural prescriptions, and also rejections of the validations of the male gaze and attention that every woman should seemingly have. So it's this issues or these tensions around how dare you as a female or a feminine body not be attracted to men. So that is the attraction to men is in at least in the case of bisexual women or pansexual women or any other category, belonging into any other category that allows them to be attracted to both men and women. So all these internalized and patriarchally influenced notions and perceptions have exacerbated the stigma against marginalized queer bodies, leading to widespread discrimination and social ostracism. So this enables various forms of violence, including sexual harassment, verbal abuse, and physical violence, excuse me, including corrective rape. So corrective rape for queer bodies means these bodies are flawed and deserving of punishment because expressing their identities is seen as an act of rebellion and also as challenging societal norms and power structures. So these perceptions also exist despite the existence of the Freedom Charter and the constitutional frameworks that enshrine their rights against discrimination based on race, or as a society, rather, our rights as a society based on race, gender, sex, ethnicity, amongst other intersectional factors. So part of my quest was to figure out how Black queer women find the silver lining in this harsh and pervasive environment, social environment that we exist in. So I did this with the attempt of documenting their resilience and the various ways that they navigate the challenges that they encounter in society and how they find ways of being agents in their own lives through empowering themselves and their societies or the people that are around them. So that is their communities, families, and as it trickles outside the other areas of socialization or interaction. So the struggle of visibility, particularly in South Africa, traces back to the 1950s, where various groups that mobilized or even advocated for the challenges that marginalized bodies went through, encouraged most South Africans or queer South Africans to come out and form movements so that they can have the positive representations or even just representation and the visibility of their identities in society. And this enabled or facilitated openly advocating for social change for marginalized and other bodies. So with this study, when I was going through the that's feedback. So when I was going through the putting together my interview guide and also the interviews themselves, I had not included issues around coming out as part of the interview guide or anything that I wanted to explore. So I wanted to have them come out organically at the risk of re-traumatizing my participants. So I avoided those issues provided that they shared because asking would mean that I'm going to possibly subject them to recalling some traumatic experiences in their lives. So I let these come out organically. So, and when I was analyzing the data, I started to see how it aligned with issues of coming out and remaining closeted, where influences come from fears of legal repercussions and societal backlash. And that's why they remain, the queer women would remain closeted. So in the chapter and in this work as well, I argue that visibility and representation of queer identities can be negotiated through coming out, which has been described as a facilitative process where there's a continuous negotiation of identities where people go in and out of the closet. And this facilitative process becomes an act of agency where it creates space for queer people to comfortably perform their sexual and gender identity. So within this facilitative process of performing your identity or performing an identity as a queer person, individuals will continually come out of, go back into the closet, whether they expect it or not. So it's those constant negotiations of being able to talk about your sexual or gender identity or not, engaging if the social environment or the environment of interaction is conducive to accommodate that difference. So coming out has been viewed as um, a form of agency that allows these different bodies to exist in society where hegemonic masculinities are held as the ideal sexual and behavioral yardstick. So the subordinate masculinities, there's issues around subordinate masculinities and the what's I'm looking for the word. So the superior masculinities and subordinate masculinities. So in the same way, the superior femininities and subordinate femininities, and that is inclusive of masculine presenting queer women's bodies. So I will highlight much later as I'm talking through the findings how feminine presenting queer women and masculine presenting queer women experience marginality differently. So for my methodology, I use qualitative interviews, and I explored the details or even the questions in depth to allow the understandings of individual experiences to come out through the historical, political, and the cultural influences that allowed me to frame the questioning and also to guide the study holistically. So due to COVID-19, I interviewed 30 Black queer women. I used snowball sampling and negotiated access as an insider. So I used various online platforms of meetings to conduct the interviews. And in some places, I used face-to-face interactions when the COVID-19 regulations were eased. Um, and then I used queer theory, African feminism, and feminisms and decolonial intersectional models. So the commonality amongst these frameworks was acknowledging the flaws in the South African social fabric centered on Ubuntu without reducing or denigrating the careful orchestrations and the ultimate erasure of Black cultural roots stemming from heteropatriarchal norms. And also, I wanted to bring out how Black cultural roots were so diverse historically, and even from knowing within our spaces of socialization, or even interacting with other people and learning about their histories, where the diversity, the sexual and gender diversities within African society, sorry, come out. So through these, we can come to understand that sexuality, sexual power, and gender as potentially, they come together as potentially transgressive, where they change or they might change the politics around belonging within Black communities of belonging. So these themes that come up in this work form part of my study chapters. And in this work, I highlight the consensus in the study where participants agreed that they have a responsibility to empower society by educating others about the queer community from an insider perspective. So there were arguments that they had to tell their stories and they're the only ones who are capable of telling their stories. So in that moment, being an insider became very important because there were details that they were reluctant to share, but upon confirmation, they would now openly now start talking to me and expressing some of their ideas. So the queer community, in their words, in the queer women's words, must intentionally negotiate their identities and assert queer independence by openly expressing these identities in society. So they also acknowledge that there are spaces that deny their visibility and reject them. And this is what affects recloseting. So recloseting involves the intentional or unintentional denial of queer identities by society or by individuals. So within those spaces of interaction. So through this positioning, they become vulnerable people or vulnerable beings in that space of interaction. So although some silences are overlooked because somebody might be feminine presenting and assumed to be heterosexual or straight, some don't correct that, which is a form of recloseting, and then some would just not even or just pretend like they didn't hear it. So some forms of recloseting come up like that, where queer women would not correct anything. So they don't deliberately recloset, but they do that for safety. So society or people within the space of interaction can also impose recloseting on queer bodies. So another element of recloseting is how it includes the act of sharing or revealing one's sexual or gender identity in certain settings. So for queer women, the participants, for them, the queer women participants, they recloseted to avoid shame on their families, to protect themselves from danger, and to be accepted and treated with dignity and respect like others. So some of them describe that upon exposing their queer identity, they would sense the shift in energy. So they will not be accepted, or the warmth that they would experience from other people would be shifted. So it's those careful navigations to see how people are, if the identity or the otherness would be accommodated in those different spaces. So the queer women conceptualized queerness as freedom. So the embodiment, the performance of queerness or of their identities became freedom. So the story showed how being queer is seen as connected to rejecting the labels of lesbian, bisexual, and everything else in between, and enjoying the freedom to express one's queerness without the fear of judgment or prejudice. So as a result, they relied heavily, or they rely heavily on self-assurance and self-acceptance, which helps them feel more at ease and confident about coming out. So conceptualizing freedom for these women involved looking at how they have constructed and forged their identities to create livable lives. So the livable lives, according to the literature, involves the perseverance, or the perseverance and an unintentional inability, an unintentional ability, my apologies, to survive and to thrive through adversity. So here, when queer people are negotiating or going through the process of making their lives livable, they find themselves having to have those communities that show a good life, or even seeing the political structures in society as protecting or accommodating them and including them in the fibers of society. So negotiating this form of freedom for them aligned with the notions of the freedom as it was constitutionally framed, and also in the Freedom Charter, where they just exist outside the societal norms through their gender performance, although it's rejected in society. So performing their genders involved, or performing gender rather in general, involves actively enacting one sex identity. So you become a woman or you become a man. However, when you are performing your gender as a queer person, you become what you know, because a lot of the times there's not a lot of visibility and representation in society enough for at least the generation of the 25 to 55-year-olds who were or have negotiated their queer identities between apartheid and the democracy, find that there's those kinds of tensions where they don't know how to perform their queer genders or their queer gender identities. So they create these spaces of visibility such that more generations of queer people don't have to recloset or find themselves going back and coming in and out and participating essentially in the politics of the closet. So one of the participants that spoke about not performing their gender and essentially rejecting the closet was Kanya. So Kanya was a pansexual identifying woman from KZN, and she grew up as an only child in her family. So she had cousins that were boys and she was playing with them and all of those things. So she described that at some point in her teenagehood, they started treating her differently in the family, where she was policed and monitored for playing with boys. And at some points, the neighbors would report her because she would now steal moments where she would go and play with her cousins or the other friends of hers that are boys. So her rejection of the closet was through saying, and this is one of the things that she mentioned, was that what was different about me as a child as opposed to then now being a teenager, because then that would be the making of me as a girl or as a woman, which I don't recognize myself as that. I'm a human being who's performing gender and comfortably performing my gender meant that I have to be around the people that I grew up with. So her identity developed around the rejection of the closet by not even allowing herself to do or engage in gender roles and resisting social expectations from her family. So another participant, Sipati, was from Limpopo, and essentially she rejected the closet by saying that she's just not going to come out of the closet because there is no closet. There has not been a closet. So she just doesn't talk about her sexual or gender identity unless it comes out, and that is whether or not she chooses to do that. So for them, for Sipati, she explained that these being feminine presenting for her allowed her to not be in a position where she has to come out. And these are some of the dynamics that you see between feminine presenting and masculine presenting queer bodies, where Palesa, who is a masculine presenting queer woman, was saying that coming out feels so invasive and it's an invasion of privacy because it involves, and this came from that conversation or that part of the conversation where she stated that acceptance suggests a superiority of some sort. So essentially what she's saying is if I'm coming out as a queer person, I'm essentially saying you get to validate me and what I go through and everything else. And then you have to accept it, allowing me or potentially putting it on the table to say you can allow me to either comfortably perform my identity or you don't. So for some of them that were feminine presenting, it didn't matter because it's just not something that is giving. But for Balisa, it was different because as a masculine presenting queer woman, there's all these other issues that come up around threatening her livelihood, just walking into spaces and immediately being rejected, and also just having those other additional oppressions or even prejudices that are imposed by people in society in general. So it wasn't just it's not around the immediate family, but it goes broadly and it ripples. Another issue was that I speak about is transgender identities and freedom. So how these are negotiated were negotiated, or they were described as being negotiated, was through some narratives by a queer activist, Anele, who at the time highlighted how a lack of awareness and education increases vulnerability of queer identities. So she explained that she works with trans bodies, or trans identities rather, in her organization with her wife. And what she's found is that people that are trans or are going through the transition often find themselves having to experience additional marginalization by having to adjust to new pronouns and legal names, as well as performing their gendered identities that might not fit the biological sex. So the sexed body does not fit the identity of the human being that exists in the body. So one of my participants, Ntabi, saying she is a trans woman, confirmed issues around new pronouns, naming, and just performing her gendered identity. And she expressed that her experience of engaging in the politics of the closet and recloseting were influenced by the fears of discrimination and alienation, particularly from her family. So she comes from a close-knit family and they're very religious. And so she feared that that religious background would cause her to be rejected and alienated. So although there was a freedom to consider the transition, which she essentially went through and risked everything, there was that fear of coming out in broader society, because what she found was that her family was more supportive and really accommodated her and allowed her to let them know who she is, which now gave her the confidence to go outside and negotiate her trans identity in broader society. So also there's issues around negotiating coming out as a form of agency. And one of the participants, who was also a gender rights queer activist, explained that coming out is a rite of passage. So it's Palesa who also said coming out elicits acceptance, but then she also said it's a rite of passage because not a lot of people get to come out because there's all these things in society that work against them. So she indicated that this ritual, this rite of passage, signifies an important moment in an individual's life. So you get to tell people who you are and tell them your story. However, people have to, when they're telling their stories or coming out, have to be careful that they're not putting themselves in positions where they might be shunned by their family or alienated or even possibly harmed. So coming out in this way, it becomes a privilege more than a rite of passage that everyone can just exercise. So it's more of a rite of passage that is also a privilege for the queer bodies. So these issues around coming out and also having to gauge safety versus risking it all and just being there, existing and allowing people to figure out their lives or life to go on, highlight the underlying power dynamics that queer people or queer bodies have to grapple with on a daily within every space of interaction, where these power dynamics favor heterosexual bodies over marginalized bodies. So it's the issues of you have to be cisgender heterosexual to exist in certain spaces. And we see these in workspaces, in families, as I have described, and even within communities of belonging, like religious groups and friend groups in some cases. So re-closeting and closeting in communities of belonging also was discussed in terms of like belonging within families or even the threats of being shunned. So Anele also spoke about those religious belongings, as I had mentioned. And through those explorations, she spoke to one of the participants' experience where Unkuli was saying, she was a master's student in sociology, had left home, came back. So she was out at varsity and where she lived. Coming home was different because now there were homophobic comments that she was now picking up. And having done modules in gender and she felt now compelled to correct the family, but she wasn't met with so much grace around we want to learn, maybe these things are hateful and all these other accommodative comments. Instead, when she made jokes to lighten the mood and to see how she can negotiate the anti-homophobic talk, she was met with talk like, are you crazy, not here, or we will no longer consider you our child. So she was basically sanctioned from speaking about queerness in her family. And this is some of the things that we see when we go to some churches where queerness is not accepted. So unless you're feminine presenting or you present in a feminine body, you will be accepted. But then if you're presenting in a more masculine body, then the tensions might start arising. And also some of the participants were mentioning that they've never heard about gayness or queerness being spoken about in church unless they were around the wrongness of performing those gendered and sexed identities. So, resulting from the hostilities and the discomfort that some queer women face, they choose to recloset and closet again. So it's those politics of maneuvering the closet again, negotiating where to and where not to. But the experiences are different, which is some of the aspects that I'm bringing out here to say recloseting is not it's not easy and it's not a choice, but it's more of an act or something that you actively engage in as it happens. And again, these expose the unequal power structures that exacerbate the denial and silencing of non-conforming bodies in spaces that should be considered to be safe. Because relatively speaking, if we look at how societies should be, we would imagine that they have to be safe. There's the constitutions, the rights are enshrined in there, There's also so many conversations that are being had, but these heteropatriarchal norms are still so deeply entrenched in our society, enough that people still have to negotiate or even engage in the politics of the closet. So there was also mentions around recloseting at work. I interviewed one of the queer women, Akona. Akona was a teacher at the time, and she described that the school that she used to work at was predominantly Afrikaans, and it was in Nelspruit, and she couldn't expose herself as a queer person, and she saw students that were queer. And as teachers, well, as she had mentioned, as teachers, students will gravitate towards you. And when the queer ones would gravitate towards her, she had to stop herself from being a big sister or even being a guardian that cares for them or caters for them in the ways that she knew would be comforting or even allow them to be seen. And then she moved into a different working environment where she even introduced a subject that was approved by the DBE, and she talks about it in class and she teaches, and the students are enjoying it because they learn about the layers of subjectivity, and some of the queer students that are, they have gained their confidence. They have Pride Month celebrations, and there's rainbows around campus, there's queer visibility, and everyone is allowed to basically perform their gendered identities if they're othered or belong in the queer community, they do that freely. And this has also allowed her to do her work more freely and passionately in that space. And then the last one, or last participant that I'll speak about, who was recloseted at work, was a trans man, and at the time he was identifying as a queer woman. He is he's a dude, if I can say that. He's a dude. So even then, when I had to interview him, I had to ask, are we sure we can do this? Because of course I can't ask, are you a queer woman? Because the presentation was just very manly. And we had the interview, but what they described to me was that they work in construction and they would often find themselves being out of work for months on end because at every point they would be exposed as a woman. So one of in I think it was two occasions, one of the employees, they found their ID document, his ID document, Otapelo, and then told everybody that no, actually, he's a woman. And this changed how within those working environments and constructions where it's like men and masculinity galore, he was now being pushed aside compared to before they knew, where they would urinate in front of him. They would talk about, the women, sexual encounters, this, that, all the guy talk he would get. But then upon realizing that he was a woman on paper, then they alienated him. So he had to leave certain jobs, and then now there's also the adjustment in his working conditions because of his biological sex. So from these highlighted experiences of navigating the closet and recloseting, we see that society remains unaccepting. And we kind of like have to consider how we can have these positive portrayals of queer identities exposed more, and how we can be more accepting of them through leaning on the principles of Ubuntu and also the constitutional frameworks, sorry, the constitutional frameworks where we see people first and not their subjectivity. So so we see people as deserving respect, as deserving their rights to their humanity, despite the fact that they challenge the normative guidelines or prescriptions around their sexed bodies. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Khaladi, for that very insightful presentation. My name is Lesejo. It was Simba who introduced, so I'll just do the facilitation for the questions, answer, Q&A, and basically comments from the audience. So we can start maybe with the first round of questions, and then Dr. Khaledi can respond, and then we can do a second round. At least we still have time. It's 2:33. Yes, Mvelo, you may go ahead.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Dr. Khaladi, for the beautiful lecture. I just wanted to ask, given that Ubuntu is deeply rooted in communal harmony, ne? Meaning that it is strongly built up on heteronormativity. So that's its social baseline. Ubuntu's social baseline in African culture is heteronormativity. So how do Black queer women navigate and use, or how do the society then use the idea of Ubuntu on Black queer women if Ubuntu was also built up on heteronormativity as a social baseline? So that's the question I just wanted to ask.
Thank you, Mvelo. Any other questions or comments? Mvelo, is that an old hand?
Yes, no, ma'am, it's not an old hand. I just have a second question, right? There's also a slide that talks about closeting and recloseting. So you shared a quote about Unkuli and her family, right? So using that, how do your participants reconcile the foundational premises of Ubuntu? That once humanity is realized through community. So when does the community self condition belonging on the assuring of queer identity? So how can the community assure queer identity? That's the second question.
Okay, thank you. I think I just want to make, is it a comment or a question around liminality, how you, Dr. Khaladi, dealt with the concept of liminality in a sense that the in-between of like being visible and not being visible, being closeted or open, or being free and oppressed. So like those spaces in between, how did the participants negotiate or navigate those spaces, or conceptually also how did you think around that idea of liminality, particularly since you are also paralleling it to ideas of space and embodiment. And I also was quite intrigued by the parallels between the contradictions and sort of like the tensions with openness and closet, and how it's parallel to a post-democratic South Africa of freedom. We in this post-apartheid dispensation, but at the same time, there are all of these unfreedoms or oppressions that people face, and how even in that maybe openness, getting outside of the closet, that safety is still not ensured. So how you like thinking around those ideas whilst we wait for others to think through their responses.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for those questions. And yeah, so regarding what Umvelo brought up around communal harmony and the principles of Ubuntu being deeply entrenched in heteronormativity, and how queer women bodies negotiate belonging in those predominantly heteronormative spaces. So how Ubuntu, or how we worked around it with the participants, was that the principles of Ubuntu speak to humanity first, right? So if we recognize the women, the queer women, as a subordinate gender, as part of communities, right, then we will be able to have those spaces of inclusion, although Ubuntu is deeply centered around heteronormativity. So one other thing that they spoke about around how they are assured is through their families. So some of the queer women spoke about support from their family and how that allowed them or gave them the confidence to go out there and perform their identity. So family or primary socialization matters, or even those spaces of interactions within the spaces of primary socialization matters. But if now Ubuntu Babo was not recognized in those spaces, they would find other communities of belonging. So a lot of them would say that if I'm rejected, I know I have my friends, or I have this group of queer people, and we function as a family because we understand each other. So one other element that came up in my study was around queer families, and also the notion of found family and how that works out, or how that creates spaces of belonging, still within the conceptions of Ubuntu, but away from all these oppressions and everything else that subjects the queer women to discrimination. So tracing or even including Ubuntu as a practice for queer people involved tracing queer identities or queer Black women identities in history. And some of them did talk about them in the interviews, and how those empowered them because they realized how powerful their sexed bodies or their marginalized bodies are spaces of agency where they get to tell their stories, and they create these alternative spaces of belonging because they recognize that society is pushing them out, but then they will reintegrate themselves through creating those spaces, but including other people or heterosexual, cisgender heterosexual people in those spaces to allow for, I guess, everything to trickle down, for the ripples to spread in society. So I think also just what I said speaks to what Ms. Khaditso had said around the in-betweens of closeting and recloseting. So that self-assurance, having a community, also allowing yourself to say, yes, I'm flawed, but I deserve to be loved, and pushing on in those spaces, because one of my participants loves saying, at the end of the day, I'm all I have. And that really empowered me as well to say, in every other aspect of life, you're all you have. So how do you push for your own individual visibility within spaces that reject you? How do you push to create or allow yourself that vulnerability to allow other people to carry you, to support you? So all these negotiations, or the in-betweens of negotiating a marginal identity or negotiating a marginal body, is centered around community, and also acknowledging that our society is flawed. Apartheid and colonialism created these spaces of violence, particularly for categories or people that are categorized as marginal or othered, or that have been ostracized. Because if we go back in history, we see how apartheid essentially tried to erase queer bodies in those periods. So yes, community, and then also alternative spaces of belonging, but still involving allies, is how they negotiate their queerness.
Thank you, thank you. Any other questions, comments, colleagues? Yes, Lavis, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Dr. Khaladi, that's an amazing presentation. Thank you so much. I just have a comment, maybe just to keep the conversation going. I'm more interested in your conceptualization of queer in this context, whereby we use it to reject or rebel labels such as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and it also motivates the fluidity in existence, especially when we now come to negotiating coming out or negotiating identities in different spaces, such as higher education or even like the workplace. You mentioned one of your participants and you said something about he's a dude. And the first thing that I thought about was the work of Asanda Benya on women minors negotiating identity in mine in South Africa, whereby it shows how space on its own it can be an arena where different gendering processes take place, and they take place by putting people into different boxes. So going back to trans identities and freedom, I wanted to ask about the difference between negotiation of identity and transition, but also looking at transition beyond transgender bodies, but transition of all of us as queer bodies, that we have to undergo certain social transitions. And then in the context of transgender bodies, they even undergo medical transitions. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on that part. Thank you.
Betha, I don't know if I should
Yes,
respond
please.
or we wait
Yes,
for another
please.
request. Okay.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So yeah, the conceptualization of queer and saying Tapelo is a dude, I honestly didn't have any other way of describing it without it making sense because I was trying to piece together my words. But I think that was the perfect description of him because you can't miss it. And even in the streets, ke baba, it's Baba Sekaya, eh, Njayam, it's those kinds of greetings that he gets. So you can't really even tell. And that's why when I first interacted with him, I didn't know what to ask in terms of do we continue and what is your biological sex? Because it's not questions that I feel you ask people. Of course, as a researcher, it put me in a position to ask, but based on how I was raised and my own background. So my subjectivities played a role here in terms of politeness or just assuming my role as a researcher and overlooking the fact that I'm speaking to a human being. So I had to now look at, with specifically speaking to the conceptualization of queer, I had to now look at how saying lesbian identifying people would exclude bisexual people or pansexuals or whatever other categorical identification, because also now that is limiting to the, or would have been limiting to the experiences that I would have gotten out, because lesbian women go through their own experiences. Yes, there's those the interlinkages or the overlaps with other women with other sex identities or sexual identities rather, with other sexual identities. So I wanted to see the conversions or the diversions in these different bodies. So as they present, the difference in how they present and how that affects how they navigate society, what their sexual preferences are versus how that affects who they approach or who they hang out with, how they speak about the queerness. So I had to just conceptualize queer as the umbrella to be inclusive of everybody. Also, mostly because when I was going through the literature review and I was writing or trying to put together a proposal, I realized that if we are saying societies cultures are fluid and they adapt according to society's needs, then a person's identity or a person's queer identity also adapts. And we need to acknowledge those elements to say no one is ever fully anything. So throughout time, you become a different version of yourself. Yes, there's those anchoring identity factors about a human being, but the social environment, so that transition that you mentioned, the social environment shapes the human being, but then also the person that is the active agent in interaction also shapes the interaction. So those overlaps around how we shape and how we are shaped by society, but also acknowledging that we're probably not all attracted to our type at all times. We could say we have a type, but do we really pursue those people like that? That is their list that we check? No. So why do we have to be so rigid, especially when we know that sex is binary and our diversity in African societies does not allow us to continue to use the binary categories to say a person is this or that. You could be any thing on the spectrum of being, and that should be accepted. So that's how we get into transitioning as a society. And I argue this in my thesis that it's going to be gradual, because now just imposing queerness in society is going to cause a disruption. So we see theoretically, and as we do sociology, that radical changes rarely ever work. So as a marginal group, as a small group of queer people, how do we now change societies and cause, or even if facilitate that transition of societies? We have to do it gradually by allowing people to know who we are and letting them in, hence those spaces of belonging, and then allowing allies to come in and also inform, or even tell the people within those spaces of belonging to say, this might not work because it might cause these issues. So how do we accommodate both sides? Because if we're saying queer people versus cis heterosexual people, it's an us and them situation. So how do we meet in the middle to make sure that there's functionality and we are all harmoniously existing as we deserve to, and as how the democracy and the constitutional frameworks, and as how as Africans, how we are with each other. I hope that answers everything that you asked, Lovies.
Yeah. Sure. Thank you for that. There's also a question on the chats from Noktula Peza. It reads, beautiful presentation. Dr. Makafula, I am interested in knowing how the participant reacted when you asked. Also, did you ask directly, or you had to find a way to let the biological sex come up? Also, what was the experience like when you were interviewing them? I am also interested in knowing if you plan to write a narrative paper on this one participant. I think there is a lot to unpack there, definitely.
Thank
I think
you.
you can respond to that, and then I also have another question. Okay, can we also maybe read out Buipilo's question? Thank you, Dr. Khaladi, for such thought-provoking discussion. Indeed, spaces of belonging are critical for one's thought processing. Regards. Okay, so Noktula's not able to unmute herself. She's in the library. You may go ahead, Dr. Khaladi. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for those additional questions. Yeah, so responding to the narrative paper, it's one of the things that I guess I've put on my lifelong project. So I was told by one of my mentors that you have to have lifelong projects. So it's somewhere on the list. I'm figuring it out and how that works. So definitely, and thank you for bringing that up. So how it was asking Thapelo about his biological sex was, so I met his wife first and interviewed her. So she mentioned, no, Thapelo would also like to participate and all these other things. So I'm like, oh, yay, married couple. So I'll get to hear how they both experience their queerness, and if, they speak from a similar experience from whatever or wherever they're coming from, which of course, their stories aligned. And in how they treated each other as a couple, as a married couple, and what values that they hold as a household, as a family. They had a son. But in the asking, getting to the asking, so after my interview with his wife, she gave him my number and then he texted. So he actually sent a voice note. He's like, sure, Ntwana, how's it? Yeah, he made a young child 1, 2, 3, so I'd love to. And it's a deep voice. I'm like, okay. So I was like, all right, cool. Yeah, let's set up a date and everything. So we set up a date, but we kept chatting because I think he was really more excited about the fact that I came up with this idea and I'm talking openly about this because he was saying that, growing up, he couldn't explain how he didn't feel like a girl to a point where he even got a mastectomy in his late teens and was just like, I'm not having these things. They're weird. They keep growing. Yes, I'll have curves and everything else, but I don't have to see these things. So that alienation or even feeling out of his own body caused or even led her to doing that, right? So that was her exercising her agency and freedom to say, I don't want my body to look like this because I don't feel like this is my body. So when he was explaining those things, gore, no, actually, I'm a woman, but mos. And then he started breaking it down. So I was like, okay, no, great, because I didn't know how to ask. So we laughed about it. And then we then got into the interview where he unpacked all of these issues around what had happened, the processes, and. But the asking was not very awkward, not as awkward as I had anticipated, because I was just like, no, let's just do it. It's fine. I'll get the details in the interview because I didn't think that any man would come and say, I'm a woman, or, or unless if they were transitioning and their biological sex was that. But if you identify as a man, you wouldn't come and participate in a study where it says women. So those were some of the in-betweens and the invisibilities that I had to, I guess, keep at the back of my head in how I interacted with different bodies or bodies that don't present the sex of or the biological sex.
Yeah. Oh, okay, Lavis, then I'll come in.
Okay, I think I have a last question. So, um, I'm interested, and I think intellectually I tend to understand it, but sometimes I don't. Like gender can be confusing sometimes. Yeah, I'm asking this personally and also intellectually. I want to understand about the notion around not coming out. Personally, I did not come out, and I felt okay because it doesn't matter who I I like. People should not have an opinion on that, and that was my way of doing it. And then there is what you mentioned about one of your participants who rebelled by saying, I will not come out of the closet, which I understand because who created the closet in the first place? Not me, right? And then now we have these individuals who are female presenting queer bodies. I kind of fall under that category sometimes. So when you're in that category, you tend to be straight passing, right? So sometimes I have a problem of how do I make other queers to notice me so that I too can build a community, and have even like friends belonging. And number intellectually now I'm wondering, sitting here, as straight passing queer bodies, are we not reproducing the heteronormative ideologies of our bodies? I understand that it also a form of agency, yes, but I'm coming down to a point whereby men find us attractive. I think even you, Khaladi, once posted about it and we laughed about it, but honestly, it's a real issue whereby you're in a social space and only men notice you and you're like, what? Am I not queer enough? Are my clothes not queer enough? It's like something is wrong with how you're presenting yourself, how you're embodying your own identity. And now I also want to understand the implications of this now that we are constantly doing research on these identities and negotiation, that if we are so straight passing not coming out, how does that affect or limit our visibility as queer bodies, our influence in knowledge production and also in language, because so many of us struggled with language till date, whereby when you go home and you try to express yourself, it's like, okay, firstly, you're using English, which means now you went to school, you got clever, and it's like you're using something that is not from home. How do we get to bring these identities home while somehow we are straight passing, we are rebelling by not coming out, which is also agency, like I said, but how do we then get to balance our agency and also the influence that we have on knowledge production, on language production, on raising awareness and visibility, and also finding queer belonging, just having queer groups whereby you will feel safe being yourself, like you said. So, yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Dr. Khaled, you may respond to that.
Okay,
I think,
thank you.
yeah, she partially also asked my question, so yeah.
Oh, okay, awesome. So wow, that was, yeah, that's a question, I guess, that I haven't really wrapped my head around in terms of how, I guess, not coming out, it perpetuates those heteronormative ideas around straight passing women. So the implications, I guess, of not coming out as a straight presenting woman is that I guess you have to put up with men, initiating whatever or asking you out and an end. But then I guess in intellectual spaces, and this is personally what happened to me, was that when I opened up the interviews, I would tell my participants, no, feel free to ask me anything, because then now I wanted them to feel comfortable. So when the questions, and it came out a lot to say, are you queer? I felt free to say it, but did I lead with that? No. So if we are looking at the social spaces versus the intellectual space, there's really not much of a difference in terms of how you negotiate your feminine presenting body, unless if then, homophobic comments start being said in social spaces, that is, and then you keep quiet. Then also now we have to problematize your stance. And I guess because we say silence is consent, right? So are we consenting to hate speech? Are we consenting to all these things, right? But what amount of agency can you exercise in that moment? So of course that requires you to gauge where, how far you can go, which also speaks to what you just mentioned around the linguistic barriers, right? When we go back home, especially in Black communities, to say this is how it is. So one of my suggestions, or even recommendations rather, in my PhD was to say we need to go back to learn our native languages, right? And yeah, to learn our native languages, and also to learn what words described otherness or other bodies, and also use those and normalize them, because some words are not translatable into English in our traditional languages, or our native languages. They're not transferable, they're not translatable. So how do we now start creating these vocabularies? And there's quite a lot of projects that I've seen, and that I've heard of, and that I've kind of gotten intel on, around creating those linguistic tools, blueprints, to say, when you speak about, in Shona, when you speak about a queer body or a queer woman, you'd say Ngojani, or in isiXhosa, you would say, what is the word? Yes, there is a word in Xhosa. There is istabane in the townships. There is unonga indoda for masculine presenting in Xhosa. So there's all these words that exist, but we don't use them because there's no space to use them or to normalize their use. So we have to create those spaces where, regardless of your presentation, you can still negotiate your identity, and also have people, maybe for instance, not assuming that you're straight because you're straight presenting, but acknowledging that no, she might be different. So maybe let's hold off on this, right? So that requires us to also go back in society and say maybe women shouldn't be sexually harassed, because that is essentially what it is. It's unwelcome attention, and how do we deal with that? So we need to teach men, especially as perpetrators of violence or negotiators of any form of relationing, right? How to not assume that someone is open for that kind of interaction, and maybe leaving women alone, which is one of the things that we talk about loosely, but definitely in the intellectual space, we have to be very radical about how we bring out these narratives, about how we talk about queerness, about how we talk about inclusivity in society, and negotiating those othered bodies in society. So it's not about saying I'm queer or not, but it's about the work that you put in to highlight that marginality, and possibly coming up with interventions or pathways to undo the invisibility, the erasure, or even the ignorance around the existence of marginalized bodies in different institutions and spaces.
Thank you. Thank you for that response. Any other questions or comments, colleagues, before we wrap up? I think we can have the last round. Yes, please, Tshepiso.
Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Khaladi, for a beautiful presentation. I just wanted to know if institutions of higher learning actually have kind of societies or kind of forums where queer Black students will feel safe being part of, or being able to have people to talk to.
Thank you, Tshepiso. Can I go ahead?
Yes, yes, please.
Thank you. So in institutions of higher learning, some do have those spaces where queer students can go for safety and others. I don't have the facts around the numbers or which institution and to what extent and those things. But with where I am here now at Salt Blakey, that is one of the things that I am thinking about, right? Particularly because I have students that are, that do not perform their identities in the sex bodies that match that, right? So it's increasingly important, or it's become increasingly important for me to even talk to them about it. So I will talk about it in class, and which now I'm seeing that it's gaining more traction, and they're getting more interested in issues around identity, not just queerness, but then identity in general. So I think it would be important to have those numbers and the facts around which institutions, to what extent, what do we do, how do we create networks where there's all these other spaces within different institutions that speak to each other, so that there's that community across the country. So I think that is one of the things in scholarship that are being developed right now, which is amazing. So yes, I think it would be one of the most important things to have in different institutions.
Definitely, definitely. Especially here at Salt Blakey as a post-apartheid university, we need to be doing much better in terms of issues of inclusion and stuff. Yeah. Thank you again, Dr. Khaladi, for the presentation. Very insightful and also theoretically rich.